swoja ojdana, czego na tym rynku nie dam pod błotą na straganach. Oj tak, czego tam nie dana dana, oj tak, na tych tam straganach. Oj tak, czego tam nie dana dana, oj tak, na tych tam straganach. Są pierniki i guziki, jest fujarka za złotych 6, są zegarki i latarki, pierścioneczek, co świeci się. Oj tak, pierścioneczek z diamencikiem, oj tak, sam raz na Ludwikę. Oj tak, pierścioneczek z diamencikiem, oj tak, sam raz na Ludwikę. Co myślicie, nie żałujcie, jak kocham was. Odbijecie se na zycie, komu w drogę temu czas. Oj tak, pobierzemy się z Ludwiką. Oj tak, i będzie po cyku. Oj tak, pobierzemy się z Ludwiką. Oj tak, i będzie po cyku.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A Century of Lights. Judaism in Europe had two somewhat sketchier figures in Swedenborg, but two who benefited just as much from growing religious tolerance and pluralism. This pair was Jacob and Eve Frank. Jacob was a Polish Jew born in 1726 who was either a radical Jewish leader, the founder of a new religion, or an obvious fraud. Perhaps he was all three. In any case, Jacob Frank made a name for himself by claiming that he was the Messiah, and then later proclaiming that his daughter Eve was truly the Messiah, making her the first known woman to be declared the Jewish Messiah in history. Many religious leaders tend to come from unlikely origins, but Jacob's were perhaps unlikelier than most. Born Jacob Leibowitz in Podolia, which used to be part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but is now part of modern Ukraine, he was a juvenile delinquent born with unusual strength, who committed small pranks on his family and neighbors, but also robberies and muggings. As an adult, he claimed that at the age of 12, he led a gang of boys that would go around mugging travelers. At one point as an adult, he even went to jail for committing blackmail, but he was bailed out by a mysterious aristocratic lady, possibly a lover of his. The community precocious little Jacob grew up in was one reeling from a horrific trauma. In the Middle Ages, the Kingdom of Poland, which became the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by 1569, was home to the largest Jewish population in not just Europe, but the entire world. There Jews enjoyed the protection of the government and suffered no official prejudice and persecution, so much so that Poland was actually known as Paradise for Jews, and became home to Jews who had been exiled or were fleeing persecution in Western and Central Europe. That tragically began to change in 1657, when a massive uprising by the Cossacks sparked the Cossack-Polish War. The Cossacks, aided by local Christian peasants who always resented the economic benefits the King of Poland offered to Jews in order to entice more German Jews into immigrating to Poland, rose up and slaughtered entire Jewish towns. Perhaps about 100,000 Jews were killed, and a few hundred villages and towns were completely wiped out. Horrific as the massacres were, they were limited to only a small corner of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but they still left a mark on the culture that Jacob Frank was a part of. First, it brought down a wave of austerity, as some religious leaders were convinced that the Cossacks were a tool of God's wrath and literally sought to ban levity. The historian Mel Gordon thinks that this is the origin of Jewish humor, since the only type of humor that could be practiced professionally was self-deprecation and satire and anything that was bleak. At any rate, the much more important impact to Jacob Frank was that Jews in Eastern Europe more strongly felt the yearning for a Messiah who could lead them to a true homeland, now that even the paradise for Jews was no longer safe. Such a man was believed by many to be Sabbatai Zevi, a Greek Jew who had been going around the Ottoman Empire claiming he was the Messiah, but word of his teachings reached Jews across all of Europe. Although the Ottomans were generally tolerant toward Jews, someone claiming to be on a divine mission to restore the kingdom of Israel was just a bit too much. So eventually, the Sultan gave him a choice: have his divinity tested through a potentially deadly trial of ordeal, or convert to Islam. Sabbatai chose the latter, along with his wife and hundreds of his followers. His movement was understandably shattered, but it lived on regardless, surviving even his death in 1676. Jacob's own father was a follower of Sabbatai, and so was Jacob. Plus, Jacob was a student of the Jewish mystic school known as the Kabbalah, even if he admitted later in life that he actually understood very little of it. However, at the start, Jacob's interest in religion wasn't all-consuming. He was a womanizer, which was probably helped by his prodigious muscles, and had a successful business selling jewelry and silk. For reasons that are somewhat mysterious, Jacob moved to the Ottoman Empire and became a Turkish citizen, living in Salonika, a Greek city that was now home to a large expat community of Polish Jews who had fled the Cossacks. There, on November 20th, 1754, Jacob Frank claims that he received a message from God. In it, he heard a voice that boomed out, "Go and get me the wise Jacob, and as soon as he enters the first room, all doors shall open before him." Then in a vision in which maidens took him and flew him through space, toward a room where he met Sabbatai Zevi himself. Another time, according to Frank's own writings, he was approached by a rabbi who was told in his dreams on 3 separate occasions to seek the Messiah in Salonika. Arriving in Salonika, the rabbi happened to come across Jacob in his wedding to a local woman named Hannah and became convinced that he had found the true Messiah. Whatever really happened, Frank, sometime around his marriage, began proclaiming that he was the Messiah, and he returned to Poland to build up a following. This self-promotion was not well received by the Jewish community. When trying to spread his message to one synagogue, the congregation there pelted him with mud and stones. He would even claim that local rabbis plotted to have him assassinated. Now, there's no doubt that Jacob Frank certainly did face opposition, and it probably did get violent, but the similarities to the perils faced by Jesus in Palestine were likely not coincidental. After all, Frank was, depending on your point of view, weaving his own radical strand of Judaism, or even engineering his own religion. But what did the Frankists actually do and believe? Well, naturally they believed in the parts of religion that most people admire. Here is just one saying of Frank's: "Whosoever does not love his neighbor and takes joy in hurting him, whosoever swears and slanders, is not a true human being, and cannot stay with me under one roof." But also Frank was tapping into the old school sayings of Jesus, which seemed to promote some kind of anarchy, or at least an overturning of the old order. For instance, he said, "I have come not to uplift, I have come to destroy and debase everything, until it has sunk so low that it cannot sink longer." Like the Sabbatarians, the Frankists rejected Jewish holy laws like not eating ham and not working on the Sabbath. But unlike the Sabbatarians, The Frankists allegedly took it even further, arguing that there was a true God and a false God who created the material world. As Frank put it, the whole world is the enemy of the true God. In order to find salvation with the true God, an individual would have to experience spiritual revelation, as well as material pleasures. So the Frankists sang ecstatic songs and practiced dances with a wild clapping of hands. Allegedly, they even had a weekly Friday ritual where a young woman was crowned the Queen of the Sabbath, and the men danced around her while she stood topless. After she was crowned with the sacred relics of the synagogue, they all engaged in an orgy. At least it does fit with the ancient Jewish idea that sex is meant to be enjoyed and should be part of the Sabbath, which was, after all, meant to be a day of leisure and enjoyment. But the Frankists went about it in a way that not even the most liberal of Reformed Jews would probably endorse. Of course, such practices, even if they were somewhat exaggerated by the Frankist enemies, wouldn't have been looked upon with tolerance in 18th century Eastern Europe. By 1756, the Frankists were not only excommunicated by the Jewish Synod, but the Synod also asked the Catholic Church to declare them heretics. Frank and his followers fled to the Ottoman Empire. There, his movement became even stranger when he followed in Zevi's footsteps by converting to Islam and encouraging his followers to do the same. Like a great deal about Jacob Frank, his reasoning eludes us today. Since he was following Sabbatai Zevi's footsteps, though, Frank might have been trying to follow up on a popular claim that had been made in Zevi's defense, that a true Messiah would have to experience everything good and bad about being a human being, including what it's like to be an apostate. At any rate, apostasy did not quite stop Frank from eventually returning to Poland and getting more followers. Finally, he embarked on another outrageous adventure, deciding to create a new Jewish homeland in Poland. He wrote to the King of Poland with a plan where the king would make him his vassal and grant him some land in the province of Galicia. Wealthy Jews across Europe and the Ottoman Empire would jump at the chance to live in a land that was actually ruled by Jews and would come flocking to Poland. Of course, the king ended up passing on the chance to create a Jewish homeland 200 years early. It was perhaps this rejection that inspired Frank's strangest move yet. He and his followers converted again in November of 1759 to Catholic Christianity, with the King of Poland himself as Jacob Frank's godfather. 500 of his followers followed suit. However, after his baptism, Frank changed his preaching very little. But this time he belonged to a religion that actually could do something about heresy, apart from slinging mud and stones. Brought before the Polish Inquisition, Frank put up a rigorous defense. In one exchange with his judges, he was asked if he deliberately imitated Jesus Christ being crucified while lying down asleep. Frank simply answered, "If I did it in my sleep, I know nothing of it. I would have been crazy to do it awake." Despite such plain denials, Jacob Frank was condemned and locked away in a castle. That might have been the end of his story, except the castle he was imprisoned in just happened to be annexed by the Russian Empire in 1772. The Russian authorities released him, and he immediately returned to his followers, whose loyalty never dimmed even when their master was shut away for so many years. With their tireless support, he migrated to Moravia in the modern-day Czech Republic. There he made his most shocking declaration. He was not, in fact, the true Messiah. Instead, he was the Messiah's father. Was the Messiah one of his two sons? No, it was one of his daughters, Eve. It was the first time in history a woman was ever declared the Messiah. The Frankists started referring to her as the Lady or the Holy Mother, while she became a central part of the Frankist rituals. Defending his daughter's status, Frank declared, "For she is the true Messiah. She will save the world. Where is it required of the Messiah to be a man or Jewish? The exodus from Egypt was imperfect because the leader was a man." His exact reasoning in this case is not spelled out. But regardless, Frank even started spreading the rumor that Eve wasn't really his biological daughter, but was a secret child of Empress Catherine II of Russia. On March 1775, history's female Messiah was received by the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II and his mother, Empress Maria Theresa. The reactionary empress was actually delighted to receive Jacob Frank, since she became convinced that he was a Christian out to bring the Jewish people to the one true faith. The much less devout and naive Joseph II was apparently just amused to meet such an eccentric, and was even rumored to have become Eve Frank's lover. Jacob and Eve Frank stayed in Vienna, not just living off of their followers' donations. Jacob returned to his capitalist roots, holding an Austrian tobacco monopoly and becoming a shareholder in a company that manufactured fezes. High living in Vienna was not in the cards for the Holy Family, sadly. The business failed, the government confiscated the tobacco monopoly, and Emperor Joseph became bored with the Messiah and her father. Fleeing from the high cost of living in Vienna, the Franks relocated to the less glitzy German town of Offenbach. Only a few years later, Jacob Frank suffered a series of strokes, but lived long enough to see the French Revolution, which he saw as confirmation that his prophecies that all existing governments and laws would be overturned were true. On December 10, 1791, he was finally killed by another stroke. At least he got a farewell worthy of his reputation. He was buried in a coffin upholstered with white silk and golden tassels, carried by white-clad servants, followed by his 2 sons on foot, and Eve in a densely veiled cart drawn by 4 horses, 20 young women who were all members of Eve's all-female honor guard, and 70 of Frank's bodyguards and male servants, all carrying torches and wearing white ribbons around their heads. At the end of the ritual, the whole assembly broke out in loud laments, and everyone threw a handful of earth on Jacob Frank's coffin. Unfortunately, the loss of Jacob Frank's miraculous charisma was a deadly blow to the Frankist movement. Even her brothers did have one last hurrah in 1800 by sending hundreds of letters to Jewish communities around Europe, encouraging them to join the Frankist movement, which actually alarmed authorities already made paranoid by the French Revolution, and convinced them that there was actually a Europe-wide Jewish rebellion in the making. But they did not need to worry. Eve lived a life of luxury in Offenbach, while the followers and the money slowly trickled away. In 1813, she did get to meet Emperor Alexander I of Russia, who went out of his way to speak with her. By then, however, Eve was already heavily in debt, and sliding into the poverty she would live in by the time she died in 1816 or 1817. The Frankist movement did not outlive her by long. But it's wrong to think that Jacob Frank and the Frankists were just a blip in the historical record. According to a Google search, among the first page of results is a German website claiming that the Frankists are still active and trying to destroy Christianity and Orthodox Judaism and create sexual anarchy across the world. There's a little bit more evidence that the Frankists were actually significantly involved in the 1794 Polish revolt against Russian rule, and quite a few Frankists actually did become officers in Napoleon's army. It's fun to think that it was because of the Frankists that Napoleon entertained the idea of conquering Palestine and establishing a new Jewish nation there, but there is no way to prove it. Next week, we'll move on to another of the Abrahamic religions, Islam, and discuss why it was embraced so heavily by Enlightenment intellectuals. See you then.